happening. We have Jiva and Icy. For this debate, Jiva's taking the position that the term natural moral realism or moral naturalism is an oxymoron. Icy's taking the opposition. As always, one will be based upon the winning poll that both competitors decide on, and there will be no moderation or time limit for the debate. And thank you so much for debating to both of you. You can get started.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just start by laying out my position on this proposition. But before I do, I'll just put some definitions on the table just for clarity. And myself and I think we probably agree on these definitions, but if there is any problem with them, we can discuss them in the open discussion part. So morality, I'm defining as a set of principles and values which determine the standards of right and wrong intentions, decisions, and actions. And by right and wrong, I'm referring to good and bad. And with moral realism, that is the claim that there are objective mind-independent moral facts. So that is to say there is an objective law of morality that operates independent of human thought and reasoning. And this law must exist and operate in the universe. So moral realism, which we can also term as objective morality, can be subcategorized into either natural moral realism or non-natural moral realism. Now, non-natural moral realism states that there are objective moral truths, but these cannot be reduced to natural properties. They are determined by non-natural laws. And that's not really the focus of the proposition, so I think we can put that to one side for now. And natural moral realism states morality can be reduced to physical matter and naturalistic processes, i.e., it relates to something natural in our world. And most commonly, proponents of this view will reduce morality to pleasure and pain, i.e., goodness is that which increases pleasure, the pleasure experienced by sentient organisms, and badness is that which increases the pain experienced by sentient organisms. And thus, people who support this view claim morality is theoretically knowable and observable, and it may be empirically verifiable. So my claim is that moral naturalism is an oxymoron, and because I don't think under a naturalistic worldview you can have moral realism. And my argument is based primarily on G.E. Moore's open question argument. And G. Moore was a British philosopher in the early part of the 20th century. And in his argument, he claimed that when we try to define a moral property with a natural one, we commit the naturalistic fallacy, as we cannot define good by any natural property, including human mental states like pleasure or desire. Because if it is asserted that the natural property X is morally good, then it is meaningless to ask if X is good. It's a closed question and true by definition, as X has been defined as good in the same way that bachelors are defined as unmarried men, rendering it meaningless to ask if a bachelor is married. But if it is not And unlike challenging the marital state of a bachelor, propositions on what is good can always be challenged, as there is no universal argument on what is good. No universal agreement on what is good. So this means they are open questions, and the conclusion from this is that natural properties cannot be synonymous with moral ones, and thus morality cannot be reduced to natural properties. Now, the other argument I'll use to support the proposition is Hume's is-ought argument, and I suspect most people will be familiar with it, but I'll just lay it out briefly just in case some people aren't. And this states that it's not possible to logically progress from descriptive statements, is statements about how the world is, to normative statements, ought statements about how the world should be. So that's to say, reason supplies no connection between facts about the world to values regarding the world. There is no way of deriving morality from reason. Morality is not a conclusion of reason, as morality consists of no matter of fact. So, for instance, you can reason the laws of logic and mathematics, but you cannot reason a law of morality, according to Hume. So you can't use reason to conclude that a person should do anything, And Hume argued that moral values are not derived from reason, but from sentiment. So, why is it wrong to be cruel and why is it good to be generous? Hume says it is the feeling of it being wrong, and this feeling lies in yourself and not in the object. And when we make moral judgments, what we're really doing is just expressing attitudes. And these attitudes are not true or false. An ought statement is just a command, like shut the door. It's not true or false, ergo moral anti realism. And essentially, what these two arguments from More and Hume suggest is that you can't use empiricism to determine there is morality, and you can't use reason either. Thus, morality, even if it exists, becomes unknowable for a logical empiricist who claims all knowledge must come through these means. And both Hume's argument and G. Moore's argument have, in my understanding, good standing in moral philosophy, and I've not come across any convincing rebuttals to them, although IC may provide one. And I think most moral philosophers acknowledge these as solid arguments, and Hume's is-ought distinction has become known as Hume's guillotine to highlight its potency. So I would be surprised and impressed if my opponent is able to provide a solid argument to refute these, which I think she would have to do to negate the proposition. And I think she would also have to address the grounding problem of ethics and the nature of morality. So, what actually is goodness? And John Mackey, an Australian philosopher, highlights this difficulty with his argument from queerness, where he claims moral values are strange and utterly different from anything else in the universe, and consequently, we can't prove their existence, which he refers to as a metaphysical problem of morality, or we can't learn of them through the usual means of acquiring knowledge, which he refers to as the epistemological problem of morality. So, in summary, I think there are 5 points which IC would have to address here to suggest that the proposition is not true. And the first one is, the first question, I suppose there are 5 questions. The first question is, how does she even know that there is such a thing as morality? So that's a question of ontology. And the second question is, where does this morality come from, which is the grounding problem of ethics? And the third is, if there is such a thing as morality, what is it? So what is goodness, and why is her opinion on this correct? And how is she justifying that she is right? And this is the question relating to the nature of morality. And she would have to refute Mackey's argument from queerness here. And the fourth is, why is her definition of morality more than just a definition, i.e. a tautology? So she would have to reject Moore's open question argument. And lastly, I think, how can she demonstrate that the objective moral code that she claims to exist is true, seeing that it's not observable, testable, verifiable, or falsifiable, nor can logic or reason establish it? So I'll leave it there, and then, we can maybe address some of those in the open discussion part.
Okay, perfect. Great opening. I definitely agree with all of your definitions that you laid out, and you did a great job sketching out the landscape of metaethics. So I think that my goal for this debate is if I can provide an account of how it is that morality could be objective, then that would be sufficient to prove your proposition false. Because if you say that natural moral realism is an oxymoron, that is to say, natural worldview is inconsistent with objective morality, then that's basically saying it's impossible to have objective morality with a natural worldview. So if I prove that it's possible, then that would be, the opposite. Um, so to start off, I'm going to just lay out um, several points on my view of morality, and on the is-ought and on the open question, and on queerness. I want to dive into those in the open discussion portion, because there will be a lot of opportunity for questions and answers there. But in terms of what I think about morality, I think any use of the word value or any evaluative concept, anytime we're talking about anything prescriptive or evaluative, good, bad, right and wrong, anything like that, it can always be reduced to a relation of fittingness. That is, one thing is suitable to another thing or conducive. So, in the same way that a square hole fits into a square peg of the same size, that kind of, it fits into the hole. There can be also a conceptual fittingness in the same way that mathematical equations. Sorry, my cat. Hold on.
It's fine.
My apologies.
No, it's fine.
Sorry, I had to just go put her somewhere because she throws up sometimes. But
No
anyway,
problem.
so let's see, where was I? Right, fittingness relations. Um, so hypothetical imperatives are conditional statements where ends and means are related. So hypothetical imperatives are really just statements of fittingness. They are the vehicles for logically stating how things are fitting to one another with respect to values and actions. So, if you want to succeed on a test, then you ought to study, right? The act of studying is conducive to succeeding on the test. So the conditional statement then um, describes that relationship. So then these hypothetical imperatives would form the structure of value considerations, including morality.
Mhm.
So morality is concerning categorical imperatives rather than hypothetical imperatives traditionally. When we talk about um, morality, we're talking about good, period. It's not good because I want it or because I like X. It's good because it's good, right? Um, and so I think hypothetical imperatives can become categorical when the condition of the hypothetical is universal. The categorical means unconditional. So when the condition is eliminated from the hypothetical by being universal, if it's in all cases, then the condition is not really relevant anymore. So then it would become categorical. So I think all cases of good period are actually just good for in disguise. If we say something is just good, what we mean is that it is always conducive to something. But we don't say what it's conducive to, we're just saying it's conducive. But how can something just be conducive? It has to be conducive to something in particular. I think this is just a shortcut of the way we use language. We use, or we say good period, but we mean good for. The thing that it's good for would be so redundant and obvious to say all the time, so we don't. But then we forget, because we don't say it, that there actually was something that we're saying it's good for. Um, and then I'll say the consideration with regard to how morality is objective. The consideration for how to achieve goals is objective, right? If we have a goal in mind, then the path to that goal we can find better and worse ways, and that's something that we can empirically verify, um, whether one way is better than another, whether it's more conducive to the goal. But in terms of selecting our goals, it's not so clear that is objective. Um, and that seems to be the concern of my opponent. Um, so to answer the question of why is morality objective and not subjective with regard to the goals of morality, I think the goals of particular individuals are indeed subjective. If it's in your mind, it's subjective, right? That's what that means. But at the same time, it is an objective fact that we have the subjective goals that we do. So if it's in our mind, then it's subjective, but our mind is existing within an objective framework. So then we can say that it's an objective fact that we have the goal that we do, and we can frame it in that way. So then there are objective reasons why we have subjective goals, why we have the particular subjective goals that we do, rather than some other goals. And then there are some goals that are shared by humans categorically, and such goals are not really subjective in this sense because they are essential. They're not really just the opinion of an individual, it's part of the human condition itself. So, as long as we can account for an objective basis for the goals of morality, it doesn't matter if individual goals are subjective, because the conclusions of morality are objective, and the categoricity, which establishes the goals, is objective. And so that I want to highlight that point. The categoricity, which establishes the goals, is objective. That's what's going to demarcate the difference. Sorry, I'm just orienting. I have a couple other things to mention here.
Sure.
I apologize for the length.
No, that's fine.
So, I want to give my what I call my justification for empathy. So, with regard to the goals of morality, this argument would be sort of giving the fundamental goal on which all other moral goals would be based upon. So this is the transformation from hypothetical imperative to categorical imperative. If each subject necessarily values their own interest. So if you consider what it means to be a subject, we're having an experience, and by having that experience, we're preferring some things over other things. And so then that means that we have things that are good and bad to us. And so then we have interests that we value. So by definition, subjects value their own interests. And then that is a universal condition that can be plugged into a hypothetical imperative. And then from there, there's a chain of reasoning which leads to the conclusion which actually forms the categorical imperative. So the rest of that argument is if you value your own interests, then you should want others to value your interests as well. Basically, the idea here is no one is an island. We all need help in life. We're born. We need support growing up. We need to be taken care of. So we should want others to want to take care of us. And if we want others to value our interests, but we don't value others' interests, then a double standard results. Because as a rational being, you have to understand that the other subjective beings, the other people, are having an experience on par with your own. And for you to say that my interests are valuable, but your interests are not, that would be contradictory. So if you value truth, then you should avoid contradictions in reasoning. And all subjects, in the same way that all subjects must value their own interests, because they value their interests, in order to navigate reality, all subjects must value truth in order to pursue their interests. So you ought to value others' interests in addition to your own. And that would be sort of the categorical imperative. The conclusion being you ought to value the interests of all subjective beings, yourself and others included. So this is the fundamental goal of morality on which all other goals can be based upon. And then I have another similar argument where a hypothetical imperative is transformed to categorical. And this is justifying intrinsic value. and value theory more broadly. So why is it that we can even talk about valuing our interests in the first place? And I can go into that later if there's time, but I suppose I'll leave it there now and we can go into discussion.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. That was very informative. I suppose because there were quite a few points there, I see. I wonder whether the best thing might be for me to just spend a couple of minutes maybe offering a rebuttal to them, and then perhaps you could maybe do the same for my opening statement. I mean, I don't know. You can go first if you want. I'm not too fussed.
Well, I think that my responses to what you had to say is really going into the stuff about the open question and the is ought, which I'd be happy to do now.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Um,
Okay. Shall we do it that way then? Do you want to? Yeah. Should we just start off there?
sure, if you prefer, we can do it that way. Um, so with the is ought gap, and this sort of relates to what I was just talking about too. Um, I see two possible interpretations of the is ought gap. Um, so there's if X is the case, it doesn't necessarily follow that X ought to be the case. So this is just kind of like a appeal to nature fallacy, right? Just because it's something is doesn't mean that it ought to be. So I agree with that. What I disagree with is any ought can never follow from any is. Um, I don't see how that could be the case. But that seems like what would need to be true for the is ought to be a real threat to morality. Because the hypothetical imperative, you have. I mentioned before that goals are subjective, but it's an objective fact that it is the goal. So you can say it's an objective fact that there is this goal that is held, and it's an objective fact that that reality is structured the way that it is, and from that you can derive that it is conducive to the goal um, to do X, and that the subject ought to do X. Um, so that would seem to bridge the gap. Um,
Yeah, I mean, personally, I don't think you have bridged a gap there. Okay, and the reason being is obviously Immanuel Kant recognised this distinction between the hypothetical imperative and the categorical imperative, and he was under no illusion. He recognised that the hypothetical imperative is not reflective of an objective moral, um, law, shall we say? Um,
mhm.
so, because a hypothetical imperative is still going from a prescriptive statement to a prescriptive statement, it's not going from a descriptive statement, a fact of the world, to a prescriptive statement, right? And I can give you an example to maybe demonstrate this. So, as you're aware, it's a conditional statement. So, if I said to you, if a conditional statement, for example, if you want to be fit or if you want to be healthy, then you should exercise, right? So, yes, if you want to be healthy, you should exercise. But are you immoral for not exercising if you want to be healthy? Most people would argue, no, you're not, are you? It's not. So there is this distinction between what is moral and what is just fulfillment of a hypothetical imperative. And you mentioned good, you don't recognize this distinction between good period and good for. But I think the whole argument of morality, the whole basis of morality, is based on this idea that moral realism says there is a good period, right? It does ignore the good for. It says there is a good period. And that's why Mackie says it's something quite peculiar. Goodness is a peculiar phenomenon because it doesn't really it's unclear whether it exists even. Obviously, that's the whole argument of ontology, realism versus anti-realism. But also, it's very hard to describe what it is. You can't really describe it in words. You can't, as Hume argues, you can't reason your way to it. And as Moore will argue, you can't empirically observe it either. So I think that is the important distinction between a categorical imperative and a hypothetical imperative. And I don't think a hypothetical imperative is suggestive of or can be used to demonstrate objective morality or moral realism.
Yeah, so I think that I would say that good period is a subset of good for, in my view. So I do recognize a distinction, but I think that to say that good period is something entirely separate is a mistake. Um, the good period is when the good for is applying in every case. The good for is good for every situation always. Um,
But I think that's what that's a redefinition of morality and a redefinition of goodness. Because when we say goodness, right, we're not talking about something functional here. We're not talking, for example, I think many naturalistic philosophers, or maybe not so much the philosophers, but many naturalistic thinkers, they argue that they think that that wrongness is wrongness in terms of logical wrongness is the same as moral wrongness, right? But they're very different, right? So when you talk about wrongness, like not fulfilling a hypothetical imperative, that's logically true. Yeah, that is correct. So 2 + 2 = 5 is wrong. I agree. But 2 + 2 = 5 is not immoral, right? It's not. So when we talk about wrongness in morality, I think what we're referring to is this sort of naughtiness. It's bad, right? So it's not just wrong, it's naughty. And the question is, how do you, I mean, how could you, isn't it just, you can't really define what naughty is. And you can't sort of, you can't really, that's why Mackie says it's weird and it's queer, isn't it? Because you can't really explain what it is, but we just sort of have this sense that certain things are naughty, right? And I don't see with your hypothetical imperative how you're addressing this concept of naughtiness. I mean, perhaps you could maybe explain to me how you are. I may have sort of understood.
So what the argument that I laid out about the what I called the justification for empathy, that would be what you were talking about. Sorry, I'm blanking.
So that argument you're relating, you are doing what Moore says you can't do, right? And this is just his opinion from his argument. I agree.
Mhm.
But he's arguing that he says you can't reduce morality to naturalistic properties, right? Or to natural properties, sorry.
Mhm.
Because as soon as you make it a closed question, you're just arbitrarily asserting it's good. It's just because it's just a tautology. You've just defined goodness, right? Because the idea of goodness and naughtiness is it's something peculiar which exists outside there in the ether somewhere. You can't really just assert that, oh, it's goodness is existence, or goodness is what did you say? Each subject values their own experience and their own interest, and therefore
the interests of all subjects, I guess, the other way to put it.
the interest of all subjects, right? So what you've done there is you've just reduced it to a natural property, right? And you've just closed the question. So now I suppose one would first ask, what is the grounding for that rationale as well? What is the grounding for that conclusion? I mean, because obviously there are people who would disagree with you there, aren't there? But I suppose in reference to G. Moore's open question argument, he would argue that you are still reducing it to a natural property, which makes it a closed question and just a tautology. You're just describing an analytic truth, right? Goodness, you're not describing a phenomenon that exists out there in the universe somewhere.
Well, I believe what I'm describing is the phenomenon of fittingness, and the way that fittingness, relations of fittingness can be structured in a particular way to account for what we call morality. So certainly I disagree with a lot of people's position on morality, but I think that in order to have our good period, we have to compromise and say, well, maybe it is just good for, but the way in which it's good for is good enough. It's effectively the same, is what I'm going for.
Yeah, so I would argue that's a redefinition of morality. I think what you're referring, fittingness is not the same as goodness, right? So fittingness is, as you put it, is the efficiency at accomplishing a set goal, right? And I don't disagree with that. I think if you want a goal, then there is a fitting way to achieve it. But goodness is something different. Goodness refers to this sort of as I said, weird concept, isn't it? That this weird law that operates independent of human minds, that and which determines, you can't even I can't even describe it in words because it's such a peculiar phenomenon, isn't it? It's just something is good. That's all you could say about it, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And you can't even point to something and say that's what good is, because there's there's no empirical basis for it either, is there? You see, so that's a peculiar nature of goodness. But what you're describing, in my opinion, is just something completely different. Fittingness is just the efficiency at achieving a set goal. So you could say that for anything. So you could say, if I want to, I don't know, if I want to pass my exams, I should study, right? That's fittingness, right? Studying for examinations, but not studying for examinations, I wouldn't say is good, and not studying for examinations is not bad. So I think when we talk about morality, the normativity of morality, I think we are referring to that concept of goodness, badness, oughtness, shouldness. These somewhat peculiar ideas. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. So I agree that there is a distinction, and I think that the reason that we don't say that not passing a test is bad in the same way that murder is bad, although I do think there is some sense in which there is, to some degree we can say it's bad, because it's not with regard to the goals of morality. So the good for, right, the thing that it's good for would be from the perspective of morality. And then the thing there too is the goals of morality are fitting to what it is that we're referring to when we talk about morality. So that's what I was saying, that the categoricity itself is objective. The the human condition itself, it's not our opinion that these are the goals of morality. It's emergent from there being beings capable of rational reflection and decision making, and beings for which there can be good or bad. Um, those are the ingredients necessary for morality to emerge out of that. Um, and what morality consists of is really true hypothetical statements. That's what I believe. So, like, you can say something like, if it's raining and I walk outside, then I will get wet. And that's a true statement, which is not subject to opinion. If you have someone that says, I'm going to walk outside and I'm not going to get wet, guess what? They're going to get wet. And we can also use this um, in, um, in a prescriptive way. Um,
Well, that's where I think I disagree, because I think that's Hume's point, right? You can say if you walk outside you're going to get wet. If you don't walk outside you won't get wet. But there's no prescriptive power there. You can't then from that statement go to a prescription to say therefore you ought not go outside, or therefore you ought go outside, right? Because there's no connection. There's no way of getting from the premise to the conclusion. There's no connection between reason and morality in that sense, right? So you can't go from the fact of the world to this value judgment of goodness or badness, or oughtness or no oughtness.
yeah. So I was going to change the example for the prescriptive one, to be
Yeah.
fair. So, if it's raining and you don't want to get wet, um, it's a fact that you don't want to get wet, then uh, you should use an umbrella. Um,
Yeah, but you've gone the fact is you don't want to get wet, and then you've gone from fact to prescription. You should use an umbrella.
mhm. But do you see that the not wanting to get wet is a value, but it's also a fact that it's the value that's being considered?
Um, well, I suppose it depends which way you look. Yeah, from a subjective point of view, you could say it's a value. But I suppose from an objective point, right? So let's say if it's me looking at you saying this, right, and I can say objectively, Icy does not want to get wet, right? But then I can't objectively say therefore Icy should not get wet, or should not, isn't it? because I have to then connect, because I'm adding in a hidden premise there, which says that Icy should follow her desires, but there's no reason that you should follow your desires. Right? There's no logical argument to say you should follow your desires or you should do what you want.
Well, that would be fittingness, wouldn't it? So like if I want what I want, then I should do what is conducive to what I want. Like that's sort of the backing for that.
If I want what I want, I should do. Sorry, what was that? If I want what I
If
want,
if
I
I
should.
want what I want, then I should do what is conducive to what I want.
Well, no, not necessarily, because that should. I think you still can't get that should in there, can you? Oh well, I suppose if you're referring to a hypothetical imperative, is that what you mean? If
Yeah. Yeah, I'm saying
yeah,
a hypothetical imperative, though it's starting with a value, you can frame it also as a fact that the value is being considered. So in that way, you're moving from a fact to a value, but it is still the same hypothetical imperative.
yeah. I suppose we would disagree there, because I think you're just moving from a value to a value, not from a fact to a value, right?
Okay. I do have a
Yeah,
little
and I
bit
suppose
more on the Izot gap. Oh, sorry.
yeah, yep, sure.
Um, so at a second layer of analysis, I think that the Izot distinction starts to break down somewhat. Um, so descriptions are always prescriptive, because there is an evaluative choice of what is being described and the way in which it's being described instead of some other way. And descriptions prescribe also for the listener to believe what the description is saying. Then, on the other hand, prescriptions are always descriptive, because prescriptions are evaluations, and any evaluation is a relationship of fittingness between one thing and another. So then a prescription is just a description of a fittingness relation.
Sorry, could you repeat that once more? I didn't quite follow.
The descriptions are prescriptive, or the prescriptions are descriptive, or both.
Could you do it all again, or maybe just a brief summary? Sorry,
Yeah.
to make sure I
So
get it.
descriptions are prescriptive because there is an evaluative choice of what you're describing, how you're describing it, and that the listener should believe you. Um, and then prescriptions are always descriptive because prescriptions are evaluations, and valuations are just fittingness relationships. So then prescriptions can also just be framed as a description of a fittingness relation. So if you say you ought to do something, really you're just saying this is conducive to something that you want.
Right. Okay. But when you say, yeah, I'm not sure I can agree with that, because descriptions are prescriptions. Well, that's sort of. That's a question of, like, I suppose, knowledge, isn't it? Like, you're presuming there that everything is. I suppose you're kind of presuming what knowledge is subjective there, aren't you? And that all knowledge comes from all statements about the. Well, obviously, statements and propositions come from a human mind, but you're suggesting all facts come from a human mind there, right? So, because descriptions are, of objective facts of the world, aren't they? So technically, they can exist without a prescriptive element, right? So you could say, for instance, because I suppose you would have to think of it from if you imagine like there is an objective observer out there in the ether somewhere, right? And he or she can make observations about the empirical functionings of the universe. So if they said, right, this observer could say there are 9 planets in our solar system. Now that's not a prescriptive statement, is it? That's just a descriptive statement about the objective laws of our solar system, right?
Well, I would say about that yes, it's a descriptive. That's why I say at a second layer of analysis, because I would still acknowledge there's a difference between is and ought, but we can kind of couch them in terms of each other at the second layer. So if we say an objective observer can say there's 9 planets, well, why talk about the number of planets instead of how many stars there are? Um, why word the sentence in that particular way? And then we have to consider that they're asking us to believe that there are indeed 9 planets when they say that. So in those ways, it is prescriptive, but it is still a statement of is.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose this is sort of touching on idealism, whether you believe there is a reality that exists independent of human minds, right? But I suppose for this, like when we discuss morality in this sense, we assume that there is a reality independent of us. So, so even though descriptive statements can be wrong, I agree with you, they can be wrong. Right? And there's an argument to say there is no such thing as a value-free observation, right? Because we all
Right.
bring our subjectivity into an observation, don't we? But from a theoretical, from sort of transcendental point of view, right, there are facts about the world, aren't they? How we access those facts is a different question, but there are facts of the world, right? And I don't know if you can just say on a second layer of analysis that they are actually prescriptions. I still think that they are descriptions.
Okay. I mean, so I mean, I can agree with that. I don't think that like I'm certainly not trying to assert that there is no, objective world, that there is no thing in itself. Um
Yeah.
so, I just think
Okay.
it's significant that you can sort of couch these in terms of each other, that the distinction doesn't seem to be, the wall between them doesn't seem to be as thick as we would like to think.
Yeah, see, I would disagree because I think, but maybe that's because we have slightly different definitions of what this sort of term good and bad, what these terms good and bad mean, right? Um, but when I think my understanding of the whole discourse in moral philosophy is that these terms good and bad refer to something, as I said, something peculiar which can't really be described, it can't be observed, it can't be reasoned. It refers to how we just how we feel certain actions are pleasant and unpleasant, I suppose, right? I don't think there's any other way you could sort of describe it.
Yeah. So one way that you can look at objectivity, or one way that you can look at objective morality, the way I see it, is objectivity about subjectivity. So indeed, we are talking about subjectivity. We're talking about people's preferences, desires, interests, etc. But we're not talking about people's opinions about those things. We're talking about what indeed is actually conducive to those, right,
Yeah, so I
in an
wanted to come.
objective sense.
Yeah, I think that's something you mentioned in the opening statement, and I actually wanted to touch on that because I find that quite peculiar. So, for instance, yeah, now you can, for instance, you might like vanilla over chocolate, right? But it's not an objective. I mean, you're claiming that's an objective fact that you like vanilla, and I suppose from one perspective it is, right? From like an outside perspective, like this transcendental observer, shall we say, it's an objective fact that Icy likes vanilla, right? But really, we do consider that a subjective opinion, don't we?
Yeah, yeah,
Because it's
certainly.
your
But
opinion,
that's
or rather, should I say, yeah, sorry.
one of a few points that are supporting the objective basis. So the other 2 points there, where there are objective reasons why we have the subjective goals we do. So not only is it an objective fact that I like vanilla, but there's a reason that's outside my opinion, outside my consciousness, of why I like vanilla. So
Oh yeah,
vanilla
well,
is fitting to me, in other words.
well, the thing is, right? If you're a physicalist or a materialist, then everything in theory is objective, isn't it? There is no subjective because you could argue everything comes from the objective universe. So you could argue all your likes, desires, wishes are due to physical processes and therefore they are objective. And if you're an idealist or a subjective idealist, you would argue everything is subjective. There is no objective because everything comes from your mind, right? So it's only really a dualist that can say there is this phenomenon of subjective and objective, right? So it's a bit of a peculiar system. But I think when we use the terms subjective and objective in discourse, philosophical discourse, we are really making a distinction between mind and matter. We are sort of adopting a dualistic model, aren't we? Or we're at least recognizing there's a difference between your mind and the objective universe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I'm a a dualist or a emergentist, physicalist, whichever you like.
Okay. Yeah, so I think so the point I was trying to make was that I think we can't say that human values are objective. So when you have an opinion or a desire or a wish for something, I don't think we can say that's objective. That is what we call mind dependent, right? Now, in a sense, you're right. As a physicalist would say, mind dependent is still part of the objective realm. But when we, in discourse, we separate that and say, no, it's not. Anything that comes from your mind is, part of the subjective realm, not the objective realm. So it's very difficult to argue that desires, wishes, wants, interests, ambitions, all of that stuff are objective.
Well, I mean, I guess this isn't really a debate about, if metaphysical subjectivism is true, but
Mhm.
like, I would have, concerns with that position. Like, if the whole world is coming from your mind, like, where is your mind? Right? It seems like it seems like there needs to be some kind of underlying framework on which everything operates, right? I don't know. But trying
Well,
to reorient.
yeah, sorry, that was a bit of a digression, wasn't it? I suppose if you want, we can move it slightly on because I wanted to ask you about, so my other point of contention, which you mentioned in the opening statement, was this idea of like this shared goal that everybody has, right? And I think you did admittedly touch on that there may be a slight problem with that. You recognise yourself, right? And it sort of is the problem of utilitarianism, isn't it? Because, I mean, firstly, you would have to argue that there is a universal goal, that everybody agrees on a universal goal, and I'm not sure that that's the case, right, in terms of morality. Then you would have to argue there is a consensus on how to achieve that goal. And I don't think there is an argument for that either. I don't think there is a consensus on that either, is there?
Well,
And
I
I
think
think
there's a difference. Oh, sorry.
No, carry on. Yeah, that's fine.
I actually forgot. What was the point that you were just making? I'll remember if you say a little
Yeah,
bit.
so basically I'm saying I don't think there is a consensus on a goal. Like you said,
Oh,
you mentioned your
there we have it.
um, valuing your own interests, etc. I don't think there is a consensus on that. And secondly, I don't think there is a consensus on how to achieve that goal.
Right. So on consensus, yeah, I don't
Yeah.
think that consensus is by any means a requirement. So objective morality is operating outside of opinion. Every person alive could believe that something X is right, and actually, it's wrong. And that it would still be the case that objectively it's wrong, even if every human alive disagreed with that. Um, and that's been the case in the sciences before, right? Even where we have, um, the opportunity, as you say, to empirically verify,
Yeah.
we've been mistaken about things on a mass scale. Um,
That's true, but at least theoretically, isn't it? You can, using empiricism, you can verify scientific claims, can't you? But the issue with what you've just mentioned is like it's an epistemological problem. There's no, you're saying consensus doesn't matter, but then there's no way that you could ever, even if this objective morality exists, there's no way you could access it. There's no way you could know it, is there?
Well, I do think that there is a way that you could know it, because I don't think that there's anything queer about morals ontologically. I think they're just logical statements of fact in the same way that mathematical equations are. The difference being that, as I said before, it's objectivity about subjectivity rather than objectivity about, number concepts or something.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, I thought you might obviously compare it to mathematical laws or logical laws, but then obviously some people will argue. I mean, that they don't exist. They are subjective or mind dependent, right? Um, unless you do argue that they exist in the ether somewhere out, like in a Platonic realm. But even then, we can accept them because we all agree on the fundamental axioms that they're based on, like the fundamental laws of logic and the fundamental laws of maths. Right? They may not be true, but we all agree upon the starting axioms, and that's why we can sort of make objective disciplines out of them. But I don't see how you can make an objective, um, how you can gain objective knowledge of an objective moral code when there's no universal agreement on any starting axiom or what it is, even what goodness is, what goodness means.
So certainly not having agreement on where to start is a difficulty, but I don't think that it means that there isn't a place to start, or that it's a fool's errand, um, that
Mhm.
that there isn't anything to find. Um, I'm sorry, I'm just having
Okay,
so many brain farts today.
no, that's all right. No, it's quite, it's going fine. Um, but yeah, I was just going to say yeah. So on this disagreement as well about what is goodness. So you're saying people can disagree with it and set different goals, but then the issue is like you can't really uh, reconcile those differences, can you? So, for instance, you're saying you presented what you think objective morality is, right? But then somebody could just come along and say, no, I disagree with that. I think morality is about increasing pleasure. And then another person could say, no, I think morality is about um, let's say, is about fulfillment of desires, right? Or no, somebody else will
Mhm.
come along and say, I think morality is about non-existence of human beings, like maybe a pro-mortalist or an anti-natalist philosophy, right? And I just don't see how you can, epistemologically, how you're going to reconcile these differences and claim that one is right and one is wrong. As you put it out yourself, consensus doesn't really mean much because consensus can often be wrong, right? So what
Mhm.
epistemological method do you have to determine who is right and who is wrong here?
Right, through rational investigation, through reasoning. If someone says that good is the same thing as pleasure, I can talk to that person. We can see where we disagree. We can see why we think the things that we think. We can see how rationally justified those are. And based on the things that we started out agreeing on apart from that, then we can come to an agreement perhaps.
Mm. I mean, I'd be impressed if you could, but I think it's quite difficult, and because it just boils down to opinion, doesn't it? It's all personal opinion. As Hume points out, it's all based in sentiment, isn't it? And just what feels right. So I don't think you can convince somebody through rational discourse. But I may be wrong on that. Um, and the other thing I was going to ask was, one moment. I think I wrote it down somewhere. Um, um, I can't find it right now. So yeah, no, sorry. You can mention your next point, and I'll try and come back to it if I can remember.
Yeah, I guess backtracking a little bit on the point of queerness. I mentioned
Yeah.
I don't buy the metaphysical queerness argument. I don't think that it's something entirely different. I think it's just hypothetical norms, just logical statements which are true in a vacuum. And when the condition obtains in reality, then the statement is going to apply, if it is indeed a true statement. As I said with the rain example. And so the thing about the umbrella, if you want not to get wet, then you use an umbrella. That would be an objective statement too. So I think that's the way in which it exists, and I don't think that's strange or queer at all. And as for the epistemology, it is a difficulty because we do have this disagreement, and there does seem to be a large degree of opinionation on these topics. I think that culture plays into this. I think emotion plays into this. But just because those things are tied in doesn't mean that is what is determining the truth of the matter. And there is a veil of epistemology that, because outside of our experience there's the thing in itself, and for us to access the thing in itself, we can only experience it, and then it's no longer the thing in itself, it's the experience of the thing in itself. So really, this epistemic barrier that exists for morality is not unique to morality. It's really for everything in our lives, and we just lend credence to some things more than others.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think just because we can't epistemologically access something doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? And there are things that we didn't know 500 years ago that we do know today, right? But the point is, like, what reason do you have to even believe that there is such a thing as morality, objective morality, moral realism? I mean, where are you even getting that starting point from? Like, what are you observing something in nature and then determining, right, there are moral truths, and then sort of trying to establish what these moral truths are? Or are you just is it just something that's intuitively popped up in your mind that, yeah, there is an objective moral code that exists outside of me, and now I'm going to try and work out what it is?
Yeah, something like the latter. I think there's basically two kinds of reasoning in a certain sense. That we have explicit or declarative reasoning, where we're stating out each of our points and one thing leads to the other, and it's very precise and particular, right? But then there is the other side of the coin, where we have more subconscious, or sort of imprecise or non-particular, more in the field of the possible rather than the field of the actual. And this, I think, is intuition. So I think that we go back and forth on intuition and on declarative reasoning. We make observations, and we get an intuition, and we investigate it, and we declare things, and then we have intuitions within that. So, I mean, yes, I live my life, and I see there does appear to be a normative element to reality. Things appear to be right and wrong, as many people seem to think. So let me think some more about this. And I've, come up with all of these ideas as a backing for that, to say, this
Yeah,
isn't
but I
just
mean,
some
that could just be
nonsense.
Yeah. Right. Okay. I mean, the first point I would say is that could just be some socio-cultural conditioning, couldn't it? I mean, somebody on the server pointed out to me yesterday, actually, Hobbes' natural state. Are you aware of that? Where he argues that actually, the natural state of human beings is a very immoral state, right? There is no such thing as morality. We just care about our own existence, and it's only society that has brought about morality, and that we've all been conditioned into thinking that morality does actually exist, right? And it would be hard to refute that argument based on what you've just said. But the other thing I will say, before maybe giving you a chance to respond there, is that you said that it's based in your intuition. But then I suppose you would have to concede then that somebody who says, "Oh, I feel like God exists," is a claim to say God exists,
Well, no,
or is
because
reason to say God exists, because they
yeah, I
intuitively
mean,
feel that there is a God, and so from that they can then determine God realism is true. And
well, but
extending that
that's not
further,
what
that
I'm.
somebody could make. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, just so that's different from what I'm doing, because so the intuition was my motivation to begin investigating, but then I began investigating, and so that is the important part. Um, if someone said, "Well, I have an
No, but
intuition that there's a God," um, then we could investigate that and determine whether there are good reasons or not.
yeah, so intuition started the process, but then how have you concluded that moral realism is true? Because, like I said, I don't think there's any empirical or logical method you can use to determine that, as Hume and Moore point out. So, what is it that's made you conclude that moral realism is true? Objective moral laws exist. Intuition started the process, fine, and then what's got you to the conclusion that your certain moral truths exist?
Right. So because there is fittingness, I think this fittingness is a phenomenon that is occurring in actuality in the world, and we are calling that morality. So I'm attempting to account for our use of language. But I wanted to respond to on the Hobbes
But
point that
isn't
you
that
raised.
question begging? So you're just
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, yeah. No, I was just going to say what you described just there sounds a bit like question begging, though, isn't it? You're just saying you're asserting something exists, then everybody thinks this thing exists, and then you're finding ways to sort of justify it after the fact. But you're not really deducing it yourself, are you, from any observations or any rational deductions?
Well, yeah, that is the point. I'm saying I notice that this is something that people are talking about, so then I investigate and I see, and I'm looking at the world and I see, okay, there are these things that operate in this way, and that actually does seem to match up to what people are saying. You just have to kind of translate it, but if effectively it functions exactly the same way, you know. That is the people's use of language and my observations of how reality seems to operate with regard to true conditional statements and hypothetical imperatives, etc. But I wanted to respond on the Hobbes point too, because I think that if the natural state of humanity is immorality, and so then morality is just a construction of society. Well, I don't think that that's necessarily the case, because morality is just a set of statements that are true hypothetically in a vacuum. So when the conditions apply, then that's when they activate. That's when they become active. Um, so really, society applies the conditions for morality to be relevant. That it applies the conditions for morality to be actualized, but it's not what creates morality in the first place. Are you still with us? Oh, I think his connection may have dropped.
Yeah, it looked like he rejoined and got muted by the room, but I unmuted him.
Yeah, thanks, Len. I'm back. Sorry, I think my internet connection cut out, but is it okay now? You can hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound perfect now. Did you hear the point that I made?
Okay, yeah, sorry, I think I lost quite a lot of your last part there. No, I think
Okay,
I missed quite a lot the last couple of minutes, the last minute or so.
I can just repeat. So responding to the Hobbes point, I think to say
You were
that
talking about the fittingness. Yeah, you were talking about the fittingness.
was I think I was responding to the Hobbes point since the last time. Oh,
That's right.
okay.
Yeah,
You,
yeah,
you're
that's right.
um, you're right. I was talking about fittingness before, and then I think I switched. Okay. So Sorry, I'm just trying to remember.
Okay, I think
so
I got the fittingness part. So I think you had just started the Hobbes point, and then it cut out, I think.
perfect. Okay, so the on the Hobbes point, to say that the natural state of humanity is immoral, and so uh, morality only can exist because of society, and so it's a societal construction. I don't think that that's necessarily true, because morality, as I see it, is sort of a set of hypothetical statements which are true in a vacuum, and when the conditions, when the conditions obtain, then the statements activate. Then they become true in actuality. Um, so um, society provides the conditions for morality to become relevant. Certainly, I would grant that. Without society, it's hard for morality to mean much, because people can just do whatever, right? But and they will.
I
But
don't follow. So I mean, if moral realism is true, right, the objective morality, moral truths would apply to anyone and everybody, presumably, just like the laws of physics apply to apply everywhere, right? They're absolute, universal. So, for instance, a lost tribe in the Amazon rainforest, the same laws of morality that apply to them, to you and me, would apply to them, right?
yes.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously Hobbes' point is that people in very primitive conditions, they will, isn't it, pre-society, will murder, rape, pillage, etc., steal, whatever, without much resistance, without feeling it's wrong. And what would you say to that point in terms of where their moral intuitions are, and why they don't acknowledge these objective moral laws that operate in the universe?
I mean, there's a question of why do their moral intuitions not match up with, the natural morality. And I want to emphasize too that what people do is different from what people should do. Um, and what people think people should do is influenced by all kinds of things besides reason, right? People have feelings. So I think actually when people talk about morality being based on opinions and feelings, there is some truth to that. People's opinions about moralities are based on those things. But the truth of morality, what is actually conducive to the goals of morality, what is an objective thing. Um, if we've kind of closed off on that point, I want to return to the open question, because I had several things to say about
Yeah.
it, and we kind of
Okay.
skipped over it.
So can I come back to the to what you said? Your
Hmm.
argument essentially.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah, sure.
okay. So on the open question. So as I understand it, the open question argument, and as you laid this out earlier,
Yep, that's fine.
not
Yeah.
not to be too redundant here, but if we say X is good, X is the same as good analytically, then it would be meaningless to ask if X is good. And then we're asserting that it is an open question. We can ask intelligibly whether X is good, and so therefore X is not the same as good. In any case, whatever we plug in for X. So my first question here is, why is analytic equivalency the standard? And I think, I'm curious what you would say to that too, but I think the answer is because we want a definition of good. Um, but the thing is that the definition of good may not be a simple thing. It may not be a one to one. Oh, here's one concept. There you go. That's what good is. X may not be the only thing that good is. Good could be a collection of things.
Hmm.
So if we say that good is a category or a label that can apply to things, by some standard, say for example, fittingness, um, good. could be an is a relation. So X is a good rather than X equals good. So, for example, all squares are rectangles. Squares are not the same as rectangles, but all squares are indeed rectangles. So, what do you think about that? Is your connection good? Oh, I think we've lost him again.
Yeah, I think his internet's starting to go. Just send him a ping real quick. Oh man, I hope he's able to come back.
Yeah, me too. It would be sad if we had to leave it there. Or I imagine we could resume at another time, but it might make the recording thing difficult.
Ah,
Oh,
here he
welcome
is.
back.
Hey Jiva, have we got you there?
Hey.
Hey.
Sorry, I
Did
lost you
you?
again. It's my connection, isn't it? It's not yours. Is that right?
Yeah, we believe so. Did you hear the point about analytic equivalency and is a relation?
I think I lost you at squares. I lost you at squares and rectangles. But Icy, can you give me 2 minutes? And what I'll do is I'll just reconnect. I'll have to log off and log out and disconnect and reconnect. It sometimes happens after a bit. Is that all right? Just a
Yeah,
couple of
no
minutes.
worries. Yeah,
Okay,
that's good.
thanks. Yeah, thanks. All right, Stone, I'll rejoin in a couple of minutes if that's okay. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Well, I hope that works. Yeah, literally. This is, while we're waiting, I'll just make this kind of fun little side point. Pray, Cool Dog in the chat says, pray to Techno Jesus. You know, I think in some kind of way, like our rituals that were formerly religious are now kind of migrating into this technological context that we're living in. Where our devices are so complex and intricate that we don't even necessarily understand what's going on the inside. So when things stop working, we kind of just we do a ritual. We turn it off and we turn it back on. We unplug and plug back in. We call tech support. You know, it's almost like a prayer to tech Jesus. you know.
Yeah, that's true. I was actually thinking of switching out my phone to one of those flip phones for a while, just to see like the distinction for just like a week to see how I would do.
Yeah. Did you see the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma?
No, I didn't. It's about our dependence on technology.
Mm-hmm.
No, I actually didn't catch that. What's it called?
Yeah, it's called The Social Dilemma. It's got interviews with tech executives that were responsible for designing um, and administrating a lot of the apps that we all would recognize the names of.
I gotcha. You definitely recommend it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll check it out. I could use a good watch.
Cool. Oh, and while you're on Netflix, History of Swear Words, super funny.
History of swear words. Just get like
Yeah.
into the origins.
Yep.
That's gotta be funny. Like I don't even know where like the word fuck or shit comes from originally, so that'd definitely be a good
It's
watch.
actually the first 2 episodes. Yeah.
Perfect. Oh, is that a good
Oh,
documentary too, Cool Dog?
interesting. Yeah, I might check that out too. Oh yeah, I hate when that happens. That's that's a tough one. Or also when you're debating and you forget what you were talking about, that also sucks.
Yeah, that's the worst when you just lose your train of thought. You do a lot of programming too, right, Icy?
Well, I don't know about a lot. I guess I've done a lot, but I don't necessarily do a lot currently.
Oh, I gotcha. That stuff amazes me. Like the stuff that Trop has made is crazy to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I got to talk to Trop a little bit about a project I was doing. Discord only sends mono signals for users. So if you are playing music through your player or through your user microphone in Discord, then it can't be stereo. So I thought, music bots can do stereo. So what if I could pipe my mixed microphone output through a bot that would just play it live in stereo in the channel? Um, I did actually make that, but it's got some audio glitches that I've got to figure out.
It actually sounds really cool. I've never heard of that idea.
Yeah. I wish they would just add stereo support in Discord and it would eliminate the need, but it's just still a fun project.
Yeah, it's pretty cool the capabilities that Discord gives you. But I do hope in the future that they do make it like just more compatible with some of the functions that like you and Trop would want to add into Discord.
Hmm.
Oh, hey, there he is.
Welcome back.
Hey, Jiva, you're unmuted. Not a good sign so far.
Hmm.
Hey, is that any better? I think I'm back on.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah, I think I can hear you. Could you just say something again?
Testing, testing. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think I've got. Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I've got you now. Icy, thanks for that. Cheers. Sorry about that. I think I last heard you talking about squares and rectangles.
Yeah, that's right. So, on the subject of the open question, I was asking why analytic equivalency and saying it's because
Yeah,
we want a definition. So I think, X might be one of any number of things that good can apply to.
yeah. Ah, yeah, okay. Um, yeah, I see what you mean, but I suppose that still wouldn't. I suppose that still wouldn't be an argument against the open question argument, would it? Because he would still say you are reducing it to a series of natural properties, right? So it still becomes a closed question in that sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, I suppose it does. But this actually connects to another point that I have here. Um, because if it's one of any number of things that we can call good, then it seems like we would need to go through a process of investigating what things are part of that collection in order to come to an exhaustive set that then we can say the question is closed. Um, so
Yeah, exactly.
so there's a distinction between sense and reference in language. Um, so reference
Yeah.
being the object itself that you're referring to, and sense being the way in which you're referring to it. So I can say the president of the United States is Joe Biden, um,
Hmm.
and I can call him Joe Biden, or I can call him the president of the United States. And those are different labels with different meanings, but they both refer to the same. They both pick out the same entity in the world. Um, so if the
Yeah.
way that this relates to the open question, if something can be investigated rationally or empirically, the existence of an open question does not necessarily negate the possibility of analytic equivalency. Um, so if we um, if we take H2O for example, we can ask the question: Is water H2O? Um, that would seem to be a closed question, but there was a time when we didn't have the answer to that question, and some people may be unfamiliar with chemistry. So, to those people, and
Hmm.
at that time, it was an open question. Um, but it's a question that can be settled, and indeed it has been.
Hmm.
So, we can say H2O is indeed analytically equivalent to water. However, it
Hmm.
could still be an open question.
Yeah, that's not my understanding of the open question, and I may be slightly wrong here. So please, yeah, correct me if I am. But I think he's making the distinction between analytic truths and synthetic truths, right? So, for instance, if I make up the word, let's say badag, and I say badag is running and singing at the same time, okay, then if I then say to you, oh, by the way, badag is running and singing at the same time, that's just a definition, a tautology, or an analytic truth that I'm giving you. I'm not actually presenting um, anything. I'm not presenting any um, observation of or I'm not giving you a law of the universe, right? Whereas if I say to you, um, let's say smoking causes lung cancer, that is a synthetic proposition, right? Because I'm connecting two definitions and relating them and producing an, an objective law that operates in the universe, or describing an objective phenomenon that exists in the universe, right? So, and I think G.E. Moore's point is when you define goodness as just some arbitrary thing that you pick out, like you have, like with existence, right? So you say goodness is existence, right? Then you've just created a definition, a tautology, right? You haven't established that goodness is existence, right? Because you're just defining goodness as existence. I think that's the point he's making, isn't it?
Well, I think, though, honestly, that understands that misunderstands my point about existence a little bit, um, because I'm
No,
not
no,
really
I've
saying
simplified it. Yeah, sorry, I have simplified it. So I'm just saying whatever you use, whether you use pleasure, goodness, increasing utility, fulfillment of desires, you can use any. His argument is you can use anything, but you're not
Mhm.
proving that goodness exists as a separate entity. You're just defining goodness. That's his point.
Yeah. So my point is that I'm not actually just simply defining goodness as some arbitrary thing. I'm examining the universe and how it seems to be operating, and saying, okay, there's this phenomenon of fittingness, and the fact that the property of existence happens to be necessary for all things that exist. Um, and saying
Hmm.
that, okay, people use good in a particular way, and there seems to be a relationship between this phenomenon that I'm observing and good. So it seems that it would be fitting to define good as this thing that I'm observing.
Right, but yeah, okay. But see, the problem with that is then any society can develop a concept, right? And then, so for instance, right, I could go and create my own society now on a remote desert island, right? And I can indoctrinate future generations to believe a certain proposition. For example, a flying teapot, right? So within a couple of generations, everybody believes in that flying teapot, right? Out in outer space,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then what you're saying is there is flying teapot realism because everybody believes it. I'm observing this phenomenon of where people think there is this good concept, and therefore I'm equating goodness to existence. Similarly, the flying teapot realism, people could equate this, belief and intuition that there is this flying teapot, and then they could consequently then try and justify it after the fact, but it's not proving the existence of the flying teapot. And I think G. Moore's point is you can't prove the existence of this goodness in the same way.
Well, I guess my question there is in this example, is there something that people are picking out in the world which they are identifying with the flying teapot, or is the flying teapot
Yes,
um,
because that's the
merely a
idea.
memory? Okay, so then is the flying teapot
No,
just a name for an arbitrary name for something that we would acknowledge exists?
exactly. Yes, exactly. It's an arbitrary name to describe a belief, right? And that's what many anti-realists will argue is the same with morality. It's an arbitrary name. Goodness is an arbitrary name given to describe these feelings that we have. And these feelings, many people will argue, like Hobbes, are just are products of sociocultural conditioning.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, I think that that is mixed up in there. There are people's feelings and emotions, and cultural influences that um, lead people and their moral intuitions, but that is not necessarily the same thing as intentionally, consciously reasoning out what actually makes sense.
Hmm. So one other thing I did want to touch on, though, is this your actual argument, right, for what goodness or morality is, whereby you say, it's based around the existence factor, right? I mean, how would you
Mhm.
even? I mean, how would you even go about sort of qualifying that? For example, are you talking about goodness is maximizing existence, or so? For example, is I don't know, is an 80-year-old living another 5 years more good than 10 um, 1-year-olds living for another 6 months? I mean, how do you, I mean, is it average? Is it total existence? Is it positive, negative existence? I mean, how are you quantifying this or
Yeah, I mean,
qualifying it?
it's I would say, in short, both and. There is no net good. There is only all of the goods and bads that there are in aggregate. They can't be added up, I don't think. It just doesn't
So,
work that
so what
way.
do you mean by that? Sorry. Yeah, what exactly do you mean?
So, when you say is 10 people having, sorry, I didn't quite catch your example. But like in questions of
I did it.
poverty,
Yeah.
like is
Yeah.
is more existence better than less existence? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know that that's really the point. I kind of have to go through a couple of brief points in order to respond to what you were saying there. So,
Mhm.
at the floor level, existence is the most fundamental thing, right? Nothing is possible unless it exists, right? That's the first thing, period. But it also happens that existence is necessary for everything that exists. So if it's necessary for something, then it would also be conducive to that thing. right? So if we consider the function of existing, rather than the goal, because we're not talking about subjects. So I'm not trying to invoke some teleology here. It's just that if something is existing, then we can consider what is conducive to that function. Whether or not it is a subjective desire. So existence being conducive to existence, then we can analyze that property of existence in a couple of different ways. So we have uniqueness, which is existence with regard to the rest of existence. And then we have complexity, which is existence with regard to itself. And the kind of complexity that I'm talking about is where things can interact with each other in a meaningful way so as to allow for something greater than the sum of the parts to emerge. So that's the type of complexity. So through analyzing complexity and uniqueness, you can derive intrinsic value, which I don't think is a quantitative thing. It's more of a qualitative thing. Um, so we can use intrinsic value though to make moral judgments in dealing with things that have weights. So, for example, ants are kind of complex, right? They're life forms, they're multicellular, etc. Um, but they're not as complex as other life forms, and they're not very unique from each other. There are many ants, and they're very similar to each other. So, in that way, the value of each individual ant is dilute, and the value of each um, individual ant is less substantial than the value of, say, a mammal or a human being, right? So that's the way that existence comes into play here. Um, it's not that I'm saying existence is good; it's that existence is satisfying the condition, which makes a hypothetical into a categorical.
Right. So it's somewhat like existence. If existence wants to continue, or existence should continue, therefore we should value existence and we should maximize existence.
Yes, roughly. So more is not
Roughly, yes.
necessarily better. There's a sort of paradox that emerges here, um,
Yeah.
because the more complex something is, the more valuable it is. But then the more of something you have, the more dilute that value becomes. So there's like a paradox of abundance, you could call it. Um,
So, are you talking about individual exist? I mean, how are you? What are you defining different? Like because obviously inert structures exist, don't they? Rocks and pebbles exist, don't they? So, when you say existence, you're talking about conscious experience, are you?
no, I'm literally talking about all existence because anything that's conscious would have to first exist, right? That's a prerequisite. So how is it that things that are conscious can value their own interests in the first place? Um, it's because there has to be intrinsic value. Um, it has to be fitting in the first place for the subject to be valuing anything. Um, so it's almost kind of a teleonomy kind of view, but I would need to investigate that more to say for sure if it's the same thing.
Right. Okay. All right. Were there any other points you wanted to make, or?
I just wanted to say, flesh out, what it is that I'm talking about when I, say existence is good, because it really doesn't get at what I'm saying, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's about it.
Oh, sorry. You were just summarising what you've just done. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I
Yeah.
see what you mean. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I understand kind of where you're coming from, but I mean, personally, I don't see how you've still resolved the is ought issue, or how you've answered G. Moore's open question argument, or how you've established that morality even exists in the first place, like Mackey's argument. Um, and I don't see how you're sort of verifying that this morality exists. What epistemological tools or method you're using to verify it? But I mean, to me, it just sounds like an assertion, and an unverifiable assertion, based in perhaps your intuition that it feels right. But as I've argued, I think I don't think intuition is a good. Well, at least currently, I think philosophically, it's not considered a reliable means of, quote, knowledge, is it? Because people intuit lots of different things. People intuit God. People intuit all, the weird and wonderful.
Hmm.
And also, as I mentioned, I don't think there is a universal consensus on your goal. I think most people have don't consider existence in the way that you've put it, the goal of or the value that we should seek, or the goal that we should assign to morality. I think most people would argue, most naturalistic moral realists would argue it's something else, like pleasure, or some kind of increasing utility, or even fulfillment of desires. So I think there's that problem as well, that there's no agreement or consensus for your position. I don't know if you want to respond
Yeah.
to any of that, or
Yeah. As much as I can remember,
make any
anyway.
other points.
Yeah. So again, consensus is not required. So even if no one really sees existence as being the basis of morality, I think it can still be borne out that it is. And I would defend that. Um, and I think that, on what you were saying before, that we don't take intuition to be a valid source of knowledge. So again, the intuition was my motivation to investigate. And then upon investigation, I found
Mm-hmm.
that there's this phenomenon of fittingness, and how these relationships of statements can fit together. And
Mm-hmm.
that it would seem that a hypothetical can be categorical. And so good period may indeed just be good for in disguise. So
Yeah.
when I look at the way that people use moral language, independent from
Yeah.
my observations, I can see that they seem to match up. That what it is that I'm observing is
Yeah.
functionally equivalent to what moral language people use. Um, and I would
Mm-hmm.
just clarify a little bit too, and say that, my justification for empathy is really like the core goal, as I take it, of morality, while the existence thing is sort of more going deeper into value theory. So the value theory is
Mm-hmm.
what underlies the meta ethics. Um,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
so
Yeah.
oh, go ahead if you had something.
Well, I was just going to respond to the fittingness comment. Yeah, I mean, I completely understand where you're coming from with the fittingness point, but my argument to that was that I think you're well, maybe that's not an appropriate way of thinking of what I think most people consider goodness or morality to be, because, like I said, I think fittingness is actually just efficiency. What you're describing there, how effective one is at achieving a goal that they set for themselves. But I don't think that's what people mean when they talk about objective morality. That which is good, that which is bad. So I think there is from my point of view, a conflation there. But I hear what you're saying.
Yeah. So it would be conducive to the goals of morality, right? And then the goals of morality would be the justification for empathy argument that I laid out earlier. And I would also add to that it could be that there are
Yeah,
many
exactly. But I still think that's
categorical.
just an efficiency argument. Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
but I think that's just your goal. I think. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and so I was just going to respond to that, but also I'm going to say efficiency or effectiveness then is another synonym for conduciveness or suitability or fittingness. You know, all of these words I think are interchangeable for the purpose that I am trying to use it for. Um, but on the
Yeah.
I actually
Yeah.
forgot what I was
I
trying to
agree with you there.
respond to.
I completely agree. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you there. Yeah, you produce a hypothetical imperative, and then you're saying goodness is well, you're saying fittingness is the ability to achieve the hypothetical imperative or fulfill the goal that I've set for myself. And I completely agree with that. That's fine, but I'm just pushing back, saying that I don't think that's what morality is. When we talk about objective moral truths, I think we're talking about something else.
Right. So it would be with respect to the goals of morality, and you're saying what I'm calling the goals of morality are actually just my goals. But what I'm saying is that I didn't derive. I mean,
Correct. Yeah.
yeah, it is my belief. You know, this is my opinion as a subject, but I didn't. It's not just my
Yeah.
intuition. I have derived this using a process of logic, using premises which are I believe not simply my opinion, that this is, a public truth that is leading me to this conclusion. And so I think that
Mm-hmm.
anyone could reach the same conclusion, and it's not just my own opinion that this is the case. And in addition, this is the clarification I was going
Mm-hmm.
to make before, that there can be more than one categorical imperative. So because there are different ways to couch or frame the particular premises that I laid out. You can say
Mm-hmm.
roughly the same thing with different language, or you can arrange it a little bit differently. Um, and those would still be valid, and those would still be categorically true prescriptive statements. Um, and they wouldn't necessarily contradict, but we get into problems, as we do with utilitarianism and deontology, where um, because the exact language we use to couch, what we're saying is the right thing, we get contradictory statements. So I think that the tricky part is just figuring out, well, what is it that we're really trying to get at here, and how do we do that, rather than focus on any particular language that might come, um, if that makes sense.
Yeah. 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 I suppose. Well, I suppose. Yeah. But also the other thing I suppose I would argue for your premises is that if they're not universally accepted, then and if people can argue against them, then they do become subjective, don't they? They're not absolute truths. They're not. For instance, I mean, I don't know how you've empirically verified those premises. That even your one that all human beings, each subject values their own interests. I mean, even that could be disputed. Um, and if there are people who dispute it, then it's not really an objective law, is it? That premise. It's not like a scientific law, like I mentioned earlier, the laws of physics, which operate universally and unconditionally.
Yeah, so on two things there. Disagreement doesn't necessarily mean that it's subjective, right? There are disagreements in the sciences, but it doesn't mean that the matter can't be settled or
Hmm.
that it can't be investigated. And on the matter of the premise itself, um, all subjects necessarily value their own well being or their own interests. See, that's an example of different wording you can use. Um, I
Yeah.
think that on that point, um, it's the empirical part is that we observe a phenomenon in the world of there are beings which have what we call consciousness, which have what we call experience, which have what we call preferences, and the combination of these together necessitates what we would call valuing your own interest, right? So it's just an attachment of labels to a state of affairs that we can empirically observe.
Mm. But I mean, people would disagree with that premise, wouldn't they? I mean, it's debatable, right? And you can't. I don't see how you could verify it.
Well, we can see that people have experiences and that people have preferences. It would seem very easy to verify that. Um, but I think oh, I just lost it. Oh yeah, I just got it back. I think that you might be talking about like when people don't act in accordance with their own interests, or when people have desires that are
Hmm.
not conducive to their interests. Um,
Hmm.
and I don't think that it m- means that people don't value their own interests, because that is something deeper. Um, but it's possible
Possibly,
to be mistaken.
yeah,
Um,
possibly. And also, I see the last point I wanted to make was on the last part of your argument. You said, um, obviously the conclusion is then, people would have double standards, wouldn't they? A double standard evolves if you don't. Um, if you value your own interest and existence, then you should want others to value your own interest and existence. I mean, that premise in itself is, I'm not too sure. It sounds a bit like the humanity principle from Kant, but I'm not too sure where that's come from. But putting that to aside anyway, double stand. If not, then a double standard evolves and a contradiction, and we should avoid contradictions in reasoning. Right?
mhm.
Is that correct? Avoid
Yeah.
contradictions. Yeah. I mean, I would even push back on that, and I would say, well, I think there is this big idea that philosophical contradictions are a big problem, and cognitive dissonance is a big problem, right? But we all live with some degree of cognitive dissonance, don't we? I mean, everybody holds contradictory views, and to say that that is immoral or wrong is, I think, again, a step from is to ought. Because take a simple example, right? Most people want to live a long and healthy life, but most people will engage in behaviors which they think and know contradict that. So they will eat unhealthily, they'll not exercise as much as they know they should. So they're living with a contradiction there. Or you could argue it's a philosophical contradiction, right? It's cognitive dissonance. But I wouldn't go as far as to say they're immoral, right? So if you want to live a long and healthy life and you don't eat very healthy, we wouldn't say you're immoral. We would say you are, as you put it, not uh, you're not efficient, or you're not promoting fittingness. You're not achieving your goal, doing what you can to achieve your goal. But I think to go from that to saying you're immoral is a stretch.
Well, it's an issue of practicality, certainly. But if we consider um, that we have obligations to ourselves, then it can become a moral issue. And I understand then we have to justify that we have obligations to ourselves, but that's beside the point I was
Mhm.
trying to make.
Yeah. Right. Was there anything else you wanted to discuss or ask or say?
Um, I just had a bit more on the open question, if that's all right. Um,
Mhm. Yeah.
so, uh, we have the H2O example where, we can ask, is water H2O? And we can investigate and find that it is. So it's a closed question after investigating, but it's an open question before investigating. So there's another example which might
Yeah.
illustrate it a
So
bit better. Hmm.
yeah. Can I just interrupt? Can I just
Yeah.
interrupt? What do you mean? Is water H2O? Are you asking? Is it made of hydrogen and oxygen? Is that? Or are you asking? Or are you just asking? Is it? I'm not quite sure what you're referring to there.
Yeah, yeah, basically is the molecule that we call H2O is two hydrogen atoms bonded to an oxygen atom. Is that analytically equivalent to water? Um, so that would seem to be a closed question. but before we had found the answer to that scientifically, then it was an open question. So if you can investigate something that appears to be an open question, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is no analytic equivalency.
Well, I'm not sure that's equivalent there, because I think that's like, well, if you're talking about the term water, right, then yes, it's an analytic truth, right? You're just defining it as water. But if you're talking about the phenomenon that you see of water, right, a body of water, this substance which is wet, right? If you're talking about that, and then you're asking what is the chemical composition of this substance that I see and touch and feel, right? Then that is a synthetic proposition, right? That's a what do you call it? A scientific, empirically observable and testable phenomenon, right? So I don't think that's the same equivalent to what goodness is.
Yeah, I mean, I can see what you mean, but I have gone over how, reason and empiricism both are necessary for anything, and that I have not omitted empiricism from my investigation. Right. There are certainly observations. I'm not just simply making analytic
Yeah, and my
conclusions.
argument is that it's cart. My argument is that it's cart before the horse reasoning, right? So you're not empirically observing goodness in the universe. What you're doing is you're starting with the assumption that goodness exists, and then you're empirically verify what this goodness is without actually observing it.
Well, but the thing
So
is that I
you're
am
creating goodness.
observing something, which I am then equating to goodness, because because
Correct, yeah,
that too is.
and that's what exactly, and that's what G. Moore calls a naturalistic fallacy. So that's what he's calling the problem. You're just arbitrarily asserting that this thing is goodness because you empirically verify that people say it is goodness.
Right, but we can investigate how well um, that matches up with people's use of moral language. So it's not just arbitrary. Um, it's a real attempt
Okay,
to make an
okay.
account
Well,
of
maybe
what's going on
maybe
here.
let me use this. Yeah. Well, maybe let me use this. Right. Okay. Well, maybe let me use this analogy. So, for instance, right, let's say people have a favorite color, right? So, let's say most people think red is the best color. Red is their favorite color, right? And then what you're doing is you're saying red is the best color, because you're then saying I can empirically verify it. Look, I can go and find out and do a survey of people, and people seem to think that red is the best color. Therefore, red is the best color. And that's kind of what you're doing, in my opinion, with this goodness argument. You're you're right. You're using empirical observations of what people think is good, and then you're sort of trying to create a framework for establishing this concept of goodness, and then claiming it exists in the ether somewhere out there, some kind of platonic realm or whatever, based on your observation of what people think. So I don't see how it's any different from creating, like me, just creating a hierarchy of colors and saying there are good colors and bad colors, or there's a hierarchy of colors, and then just verifying that by speaking to people and getting their opinions.
I think that the two things are completely different. I think that what you just described would be analogous to taking the goals of morality by consensus. So whatever the most people care about, that's what morality would be concerned with, and that is not my position. Um, I have another example on the sense and reference
Mhm.
objection. So
Okay. Was there something else you wanted to say on the open question argument, or was that pretty much it?
Yeah, so I have another example. It's called the masked man. Um, so there's a there's a citizen in a town in the Wild West, and the sheriff tells the citizen, "Hey, your brother has been putting on a mask and robbing banks." And the citizen is like, "Oh my goodness, my brother, I don't think he would do that, but I don't know." And so, there's a question of, is the masked man the citizen's brother? So to the citizen, that is an open question, but it may actually be the case that the citizen's brother is the masked man, or that he isn't. And in either case, then it would be a closed question, and that is something that the citizen could investigate and find out. So then the open question can become a closed question. So the presence of an open question, if indeed we accept Moore's premise too, that X is good is an open question. That doesn't necessarily the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow that then X is certainly not analytically equivalent to good, as long as it's something that can be investigated.
Mm.
Is um
Yeah.
is that making sense?
I think. Yeah, sorry, it cut out a little bit. I missed the bank robber analogy when you said what the sheriff comes to the man and says your brother was wearing a mask, and then it cut out slightly. What
Oh
was the
yes,
conclusion of that?
I'm
Yeah.
sorry. So yeah, the sheriff says to the citizen, "Your brother's been robbing banks, putting on a mask," and the citizen doesn't know if that's true. Um, so to the citizen, it's an open question, but it is a closed question. It is one or the other. He's either um, the masked man or he isn't. So that's something that the citizen can investigate and find out. So because it's something he can investigate, then just because it's an open question to the citizen
Yeah.
doesn't mean that it's not analytically equivalent.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's analogous because I think that's a synthetic proposition. You're relating two definitions. You're saying there is I have a brother who exists independently and he robbed a bank. That fact exists independently as well, and you're relating them. G. Moore's point is that when you define goodness, you're just creating an analytic truth proposition. You're just saying good is this in the same way that I say, um, a bachelor is an unmarried man, right? So that's a closed question. So it's a closed. You can't then ask, well, is this bachelor married? Can you? Right? It's a closed question because it's analytically true that the bachelor is unmarried. So that's his argument that it's just a definition when a naturalist um, claims goodness is X.
Okay. Yeah, that is interesting. I would just say that, you know, um, it's not merely arbitrary that I attach good to what I have, right? The concepts don't just arbitrarily attach to each other. There's
Yeah,
a conceptual fittingness,
yeah.
and so that I have tried to observe a phenomenon in the world, which I've described, and so I relate that to good by the fittingness of the description or of the explanation um, to the phenomenon. But I would just say one other thing on the open question, which is
Yeah, I
that
think we may just have to agree to disagree. I think we have different positions here, don't we?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, on the open question, it's tough. One more point on that though, that I think more begs the question in his second premise. He just asserts that it is
Mhm.
an open question if X is good, and it may be an open question to Moore, but that doesn't mean that it can't be a closed question by investigating it.
Mhm. Okay, I mean, and I understand the point you're making, but I would just push back and say I think you're just arbitrarily asserting what good is according to your preferences, but you're not proving to me that goodness exists in the ether out there. So I think that's just probably the last thing I'll say on that.
Yeah, and then just to respond, like, I don't know if good per se exists out in the ether, but there's something that exists out in the ether, and we can call that good, and that seems to work. But I can leave it there.
Well, yeah, but okay, I'll just leave it there. That's fine. What was it? Yeah, was there anything else you wanted to say
That
or
was about it.
finish off with? Yeah, I think I'm done as well. So that's, yeah. Well, thanks for the discussion.